Oh, I can't wait for this. It's going to be a big time card. And I've got the man himself, the president of the UFC, the man who built this into what it is today, the one and only Dana White, right here with Stephen A. What's going on, big time? How are you, sir? How's everything?
Good morning, my friend. I'm awesome. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to see you. You know, you became the president in 2001. It's 23 years later now, and we're looking at UFC 300. How would you describe the journey to reach UFC 300? Put it into your own words.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing. Obviously, taking this thing from a sport that wasn't allowed on pay-per-view and making it mainstream, not just in the United States, but globally, all over the world. It's been fun. And you know, when we hit UFC 100, the fans sort of rallied around it, made a big thing. So then 200, and then now here's 300. So how do you beat 100 and 200? You put on the greatest combat sports card ever assembled.
And that's you've been talking about the UFC 300 in that fashion. You've been raving about this card. I want you to get into how did you go about building the card for this historic event. Talk about that for a second.
Well, you know, when you look at it, we had 12 current and former champions. 7 fighters are ranked in the pound for pound, 16 in the top 15. So basically, this card from the first fight of the night, the very first prelim to the main event, are all big time fights and all important. And when you think about it, it's the greatest card ever assembled in combat sports history, not just the UFC, not just MMA, ever.
Why would you say that? I mean, listen, I think one of the greatest events I've ever been to in my life, in my 30 years of coaching, of working in this business, I don't know if I've ever been to a bigger event than Conor McGregor versus Nurmagomedov. I know you've got Pereira versus Hill. Obviously, it's a big-time main event. But when you talk about it in that fashion, what do you think makes this comparable to any event that we've seen in UFC history?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when you think about any fight that we've ever done or that boxing does, there's always big main events, big co-main events with stars. But when you talk about a card from top to bottom, the very first fight of the night until the main event, I mean, the first fight of the night on ESPN is Figueiredo versus Garbrandt. They're both former world champions. Figueiredo has broke a ton of records, most knockdowns in UFC flyweight history, most submission attempts, and Garbrandt tied most knockdowns in bantamweight history, and the list goes on of all these records that these guys have broken. That's the very first fight of the night. That could main event on a card. So basically, the first fight of the night could main event, and that's how every single fight throughout the rest of the night is.
When we think about the UFC, one of the things that I love about the UFC, Dana, watching it, I got such profound respect for all of these fighters. Just walking into the octagon, you got to have a level of bravery that most people simply don't have. But what I love about what you've done with the sport, which a sport like boxing hasn't done, is that somebody gets one loss, one blemish on their record. That's a reason to veer away from them, to not look at them in the same fashion. That's not what happens in the UFC. You could have a loss, you could have a couple of losses, and your appeal still doesn't necessarily diminish. Why do you think that is the case with the UFC, and how have you assisted in pulling that off for the audience?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, in boxing, the way that it worked is you would pad these records and get these guys to a certain number where they're undefeated with so many knockouts, or there was somebody that was great enough to do it. Like a Floyd and basically
Right,
what I
Pacquiao
learned
and others. Yep.
yeah. There was a guy named Arturo Gatti, okay?
Yes.
And he had several losses, yet kept signing massive deals with HBO because what people want the warriors, the guys who go out and leave it all out there, fight the best, fight the fights that people want to see. When you go out and you do that, like in the UFC, there's no padding of records. You come right in and you start fighting the best of the best. And if you make it into the top 10 and into the top 5 or a world champion, you have run through the gauntlet of the nastiest dudes in the world in your weight class. And at the end of the day, what people want to see are great fights. You don't have to be, if you become very special and unique in this sport, like a John Jones, and become undefeated, then it's just that much more, amazing when it happens. And like you said, Habib.
Yep. Pereira versus Hill. That's the main event. And I want you to talk about Pereira for a second because his nickname is the Hands of Stone. Back in the day with people that were watching boxing before they were watching UFC, when we heard Hands of Stone, we thought about Roberto Duran. When you look at this guy right here, he's a knockout artist. He's definitely an elite striker. Talk about him and what he means to the sport at this particular moment in time, because he's definitely somebody I consider to be box office.
I agree. And when you think about Brazil, Brazil is where it all started. And we're always, there's always been these huge stars that have come out of Brazil. He is the new big star for Brazil. I mean, he's obviously big everywhere, but, he's one of the greatest kickboxers ever. He's the first and only fighter to win the middleweight and light heavyweight titles. Did it in the shortest and fewest fights to win 2 titles in 2 different divisions. He did it in 2 years and 7 fights. And when you think about a guy like this, Alex knocks people out who have never been knocked out before. The guy is an absolute stud.
I'm looking at Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. I'm interested in that. There's no question about it. You got Kayla Harrison making her UFC debut against the always tough Holly Holmes. What should fans expect from those matchups?
Yeah, I mean, Holly Holm is an absolute legend, not just in mixed martial arts, but in combat sports, period. Kickboxing, boxing, one of the most decorated female fighters of all time, if not the most decorated, going in against Kayla Harrison, who's a 2-time Olympic gold medalist in judo and has finished like 12 out of her 16 opponents. So it's a big test for Kayla, and obviously a huge fight for Holly at this point in her career. If she could beat Kayla Harrison, and it just cements an absolutely already incredible career that she's had.
You've got
and Max Holloway, always a big fan favorite, probably the greatest featherweight of all time, going up against Gaethje, who was a human highlight reel.